This is part 1 of the read-along for Unit 3.03, Realism and Naturalism 2. Many American artists embraced realism in the mid-19th century. Realism began in France but soon caught on throughout Europe and the United States. Artists focused on contemporary themes, producing realistic depictions of their newly industrialized society. So even though realism started off in France, it eventually came over to the United States, where artists made contemporary themes, meaning what was going on at the time, like everyday scenes of everyday life. They produced realistic depictions of their newly industrialized society. Be sure and download this student guide to go along with your reading of this unit. And as you read through the lesson, use that student guide to take notes about each screen. You may also make quick sketches of the images to go with your notes. America in the 19th century. During the 1800s, the United States experienced the Industrial Revolution, endured a costly fratricidal conflict, and wrestled with the social issues created by the war's outcome. In the first half of the century, new modes of transportation and communication had stitched the country together, but other forces were tearing it apart. Northern states embraced industrialization, while the South remained largely agricultural, with an economy reliant on slave labor. Regional differences led 11 Southern states to secede from the Union in 1861. So, during the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution came to the United States. The U.S. endured a costly fratricidal conflict. Fratricide means killing a brother, so this is a reference to the Civil War, a costly fratricidal conflict, and wrestled with the social issues created by the war's outcome. So once the war was over, we had social issues afterwards. In the first half of the century, new modes of transportation and communication had stitched the country together, so that's steam power and trains, like we've spoken about in previous units. Communication being the telegraph, stitching the country together, meaning connecting people across wide distances, but other forces were tearing it apart. Northern states embraced the industrialization, while the South remained largely agricultural, with an economy reliant on slave labor. Agricultural meaning related to farming. Regional differences led 11 Southern states to secede from the Union in 1861. The Civil War that followed was the first modern industrial conflict. Factories mass-produced weapons. Railroads moved bodies of troops over great distances. Commanders sent orders by telegraph. Navies fought with ironclad ships. And photographers worked alongside sketch artists on the battlefield to document the carnage. So, this was the first big modern war after the Industrial Revolution. So those factories that we've talked about producing goods for people are now producing weapons. The railroads that were moving people and goods are now moving troops. Commanders are using this new technology of telegraphs to communicate orders. Navies are fighting with these new ironclad ships. And photographers and sketch artists are going along with the soldiers on the battlefield to document everything. So this is the first war that we have actual photographs from. At war's end in 1865, the newly reunited country faced a vexing problem. What to do about the 3.5 million former slaves in the South who were now citizens? For African Americans, it was only the beginning of a long, slow, and often frustrating struggle for civil rights. So the war is over, but now we have 3.5 million people that were slaves a few years before, and now they're brand new American citizens. And that is basically the start of the American civil rights struggle and movement. American Realism and Naturalism. In post-Civil War America, many artists rejected the neoclassical style that turned to the art of classical Greece and Rome for inspiration. Instead, in a style originating in France, realist artists sought to portray the reality of present-day human experience. They captured on canvas scenes of common people living their lives. Naturalist artists turned to the natural world for inspiration, painting humans and nature as they saw them, without a sense of idealization. The American public appreciated these styles of art that look real. So post-Civil War America, post meaning after, many artists rejected the neoclassical sort of traditional style of art that they had been making before, and they looked to this style that was coming out of France called realism. Realist artists wanted to show the everyday, present-day human experience. They captured on canvas scenes of common people living their lives. This is a big theme, common people living their lives. Naturalist artists turned to the natural world, so landscapes, the outdoors. They painted humans and nature as they saw them without a sense of idealization. So exactly as you see somebody, all their wrinkles and warts and everything, you would paint them exactly as you saw them. You would not try to idealize them and make them look better than what they really looked in real life. And the American people appreciated this style. Winslow Homer. Born in 1836 in Boston, Winslow Homer was a mainly self-taught, versatile illustrator, oil painter, and watercolorist. After a brief apprenticeship with a local lithographer as a teenager, Homer began working for the well-known periodical Harper's Weekly. At that time, there was no process for printing photographs in a newspaper. Homer's task was to convert photographic images into accurate line drawings, which would then be carved onto a wooden block and inked for printing. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Harper's expanded Homer's role by sending him to the front to create his own illustrations of events. So we've got this guy, Winslow Homer, who's born in 1836 in Boston. He's mostly self-taught, meaning he didn't really go to school, didn't really go to art school. He's an illustrator, an oil painter, and a watercolorist. He had a brief apprenticeship, meaning he studied for a little while with a local lithographer. That's a person who makes a certain type of print. Then he went to work for a periodical, which is like a magazine, called Harper's Weekly. At that time, there was no process for printing photographs in a newspaper, so Homer had to take photos that other people took, and he would have to draw them. He'd have to create accurate line drawings, and then somebody would take those line drawings and carve it into a piece of wood, and then they would roll ink on it, and then they would print that on the paper. So it was the whole process of taking a photo to a drawing to a wood block to being printed in the newspaper. And then in 1861, when the Civil War broke out, Harper's, this magazine that he worked for, sent Homer to the front, meaning the battle lines, and it was his job to draw pictures of what was happening in the war. Homer moved to New York after the war ended in 1865 and continued his career as an illustrator while also developing his talents as an oil painter. He created genre paintings of people farming, hunting, fishing, and children at play. Later in his career, he discovered the luminous quality of watercolors and moved to the Maine coast to paint extraordinary seascapes and scenes of marine life. So after the war's over, he goes to New York and continues illustrating, and he starts oil painting. He makes paintings of people farming, hunting, fishing, and kids playing. And then even later in his career, he discovers he really likes watercolors. And so he moves to Maine to live on the coast and paint extraordinary seascapes, which is like a landscape, but featuring the ocean, and scenes of marine life. So animals and plants that live in and around the ocean. Homer's Prisoners from the Front. Homer's employment with Harper's Weekly gave him unprecedented access to the war front in Virginia. He made keen observations of soldiers and produced many lifelike sketches. After the war, Homer incorporated these images into his first oil paintings. So, during the war, he went to Virginia to document the fighting that was going on there. And he would make keen observations, which means he really studied the way these soldiers looked, and he made a lot of really detailed lifelike sketches. And then after the war was over, he took these sketches and he made them into oil paintings. While the title may be generic, Prisoners from the Front tells the story of an actual event. Homer based the painting on several sketches that he had made during the time he spent in camp and on the march with the Union Army in 1864. So this painting is the one that we're talking about, and it refers to an actual event that Homer saw happen. So he saw this exchange of prisoners. These three men here are being turned over to a Union general. Explore Prisoners from the Front activity on the next screen to examine the elements of this important work. Be sure and click through this whenever you're going through the content on your own. There's some good detailed views of this painting on here. Homer's Realism. Homer was widely admired for his realist style. He did not romanticize the miseries of war. With the desire to depict the truth, he thoughtfully documented the soldiers and prisoners from the front as true individuals with stories to tell of hopes and hardships. His muted palette reveals the captured soldiers' expressions, posture, and varying states of psychological distress. All eyes are on the polished, self-assured Union general. The subdued colors in the ravaged landscape do not distract from the figures in the foreground. So, what they're saying here is that he was really admired and recognized for his realist style because he didn't romanticize the miseries of war. He didn't make it look like it was better than it was. He showed people how bad this war really was. He wanted to show the truth, and so he documented the soldiers in this painting, Prisoners from the Front, as true individuals with stories to tell of hopes and hardships. He wanted these to look like real people because they really were. His muted palette meaning the colors that he chose, and muted meaning that they're not bright colors, they're earthy and muddy and kind of dirty colors, reveal the captured soldiers' expressions, posture, and varying states of psychological distress. So these colors are used to sort of show what these men, these prisoners, were going through and how they were feeling about it. All eyes are on the polished, self-assured Union general, meaning the focal point of the painting is the Union general who's accepting the prisoners of war. The subdued colors in the ravaged landscape do not distract from the figures in the foreground. So the subdued colors, again, it's those muddy, earthy colors in the ravaged landscape being ravaged by war, so it's been hit with cannons and run over by people and horses. But it does not distract from the figures in the foreground, meaning the people in the painting. Explore prisoners' activity on the next screen to see just how realistic Homer's portrayal of Confederate prisoners really is. And you will do that on your own as you go through the content.